Good afternoon, welcome to another A-Push video with Mr. Pate. Today we're looking at Reagan's foreign policy, and we start with the Reagan Doctrine. The Reagan Doctrine essentially takes a page out of part of the flexible response from John F. Kennedy's administration and says we're going to use covert and non-covert attempts to stop communist infiltration and takeovers in third world countries. This is a combination of containment, not allow it to expand any further. It's a combination of rollback. We will basically try and get rid of it where it exists already. And what that's going to mean, that's the Reagan Doctrine, and that's how it's going to be manifested. The evil empire. Reagan would talk about the Soviet Union in very stark terms. The Soviet Union was bad, the United States was good, and basically he calls the Soviet Union famously early in his first term, it's the evil empire. Reagan is going to go so far as to say the Soviet Union is decrepit. It is headed for the ash heap of history. History is going to look back, and these will be the final days and the last chapters in this pathetic effort. Here's a picture of our good old President Reagan right here. And Reagan is going to just use this he's not trying to be diplomatic. He's not trying to be vague or ambiguous. He wants to starkly lay out that they are our enemy and we need to stop them. And so that is what he's going to attempt to do. And one of the ways he's going to do this, when he came up with these statements, they weren't rhetoric. I mean, they were rhetoric, but they weren't just empty, baseless rhetoric. His statements that he made were based on CIA reports that the Soviet Union was economically close to bankruptcy. It was a broken model. You may remember from a previous podcast, the last few presidents in the 1970s had made arms reduction deals and agreed to sell grain shipments to the Soviet Union. This starts with Nixon on his visit, his famous breakthrough visit to the Soviet Union in 1972. And so, the Soviet Union was unable to produce enough goods on its own, not able to produce enough food for its own survival. So the Soviet Union is essentially struggling economically. And they also have an unwieldy problem. They spend almost 1/4, 24% of their money, of their GDP, that's the kind of their national output of production of wealth for a year, they spend on military and defense spending. You can't do that. That's quite unsustainable. The United States was nowhere near as high. But Reagan is going to say, we're gonna up the ante, raise the stakes right now, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to spend more and develop new weapons like the MX missile, and we're going to push for next generation equipment. That you're going to see it push to increase toward things like stealth technology and all kinds of next generation weapons. Some of which we're going to prove to be very fruitful. Some of which we're going to be kind of like, well, that was kind of a waste. The MX missile, okay, great. We had plenty of missiles that could hit and destroy the other side already. But the one he brings up that's going to be very interesting and controversial is Star Wars. SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. This is the idea of Star Wars. Essentially, the idea was you would have a three-stage way to deal with a missile launched by the Soviet Union. It was attempting a missile defense shield, essentially. You would have opportunities through jet airplanes and submarines when missiles were going up and when missiles especially were coming down near U.S. targets to try and stop them, maybe even ground-launched ones. But you'd also have satellites able to shoot lasers and destroy them when they kind of went up into the high atmosphere that would be able to shoot down these missiles. Some scientists, members of the media, said this is completely impossible, it's never going to work. Here's what matters. Not that it didn't work. The Soviet Union freaked out. They spent more money. They ratcheted up when they could not afford to and spent even more to their later demise. So Reagan's choosing to spend more money on the Cold War essentially is going to bankrupt the Soviet Union, and that works out brilliantly. Some of these Reagan Doctrine kind of proxy wars that are going to go on. El Salvador. El Salvador had a government that was anti-communist, but they had rebels that were communist. The United States is going to work with neighboring countries to try and stop the communists from getting any missile shipments in. The United States is going to really just be with a goal of stopping those rebels. And they're going to give aid and support to the El Salvadoran government. A lot of violence occurs, and essentially it's kind of a stalemate situation. it's not a great victory for the United States. But what is a great victory for the United States, well, maybe a small victory for the United States, is Grenada. Grenada is a tiny island, and if you had Cuba or Florida up here, and Cuba and Haiti, Haiti and Dominican Republic, there's a chain of islands that comes down here towards South America, and right near the bottom by South America is Grenada. This is an island of only a little over 100,000 people, but the United States is going to basically send in troops, and the reason they do this is they had kind of a communist government in place, and then it got replaced by a hardline communist group, like military dictatorship of generals. When that occurs, the neighboring islands and countries say, we want this to get snuffed out. They wanted to align themselves with Cuba, and that was not something the United States was interested in. So with the neighbors of Grenada and the United States interested, the United States invades Grenada, wipes out, and gets rid of this communist hardline government. The Grenadian population was very happy about this. It kind of is the first major interaction the United States has had, if you can call it major at all, since Vietnam. So that's Grenada, and the United States actually kind of feels a little bit successful. The population feels good about this, even though it's this tiny island, because the United States hadn't put boots on the ground really too much since Vietnam, and was not very encouraged about that. Nicaragua. Nicaragua is going to be the opposite of El Salvador. Here, the government that is in place, called the Sandinistas, is trying to align with Cuba and getting supplies from the Soviet Union. It's a communist government, and the United States is not going down with this. So the rebel group called the Contras, the United States is going to want to give them support. Reagan champions the Contras big time. Congress says, we're not going to get involved. We're not going to give them money, supplies, weapons. We're not going to do that. So, members of Reagan's administration are going to say, let's start making arms deals with Iran to get the Contras, arms deals with Iran to get the Contras some military supplies. When this is objected to by the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration, they're frozen out, and this becomes kind of a National Security Council operation that's really like some of the parts of the White House are being kept in the dark. Eventually it comes out that this has been going on behind Congress's back and even behind some members prominent in those types of positions like Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration. Reagan claims no knowledge of this. It is the one scandal that kind of stains his presidency, I guess you could say, with foreign affairs. But he's considered kind of this Teflon president. It doesn't affect him too much. It does hurt his administration's image a little bit, and several people have to resign or are fired for their roles in this, and some of them get some jail time. Lebanon, you have this crazy situation where terrorists supported by Iran, you have Syria's involvement in Lebanon, you have different factions of the Lebanese themselves, and then the PLO, these refugees kicked out of Israel when Israel kind of takes control and gets attacked in 1948 and declares its independence. These PLO people are launching attacks into northern Israel. When they launch these attacks, essentially Israel is going to invade the southern part of Lebanon, and it's a real dicey, messy situation. Trying to help stabilize the situation, the United States, France, and other countries are going to send in troops, and when they send these troops into Lebanon, essentially the ultimate thing that happens is suicide bombings hit the United States Embassy and the French and U.S. military barracks, and over 200 Marines are going to die in this big suicide bombing. So Reagan is going to kind of pull out. Eventually that situation gets settled, but it's really a very messy decade for a former tourist country of Lebanon. Okay, so up here we had hardliner, evil empire, Soviet Union is bad news, Reagan. Now we have Reagan kind of taking a different stance, being a peacemaker. We talked about how the Soviet Union was on the verge of going bankrupt, and Reagan drives them to even greater military spending because of Star Wars and other ways he's escalated things. So the thawing of the Cold War. Essentially, I guess we better start down here. Gorbachev, knowing he can't maintain that level of military spending, he's going to introduce programs called Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost means reform, and it's kind of a restructuring. Essentially, we're going to spend less on military. We can't support third world global efforts of communism, and we are going to instead, we're going to try and reform our economy and improve our economy. And perestroika is new openness. And the Soviet Union was kind of a 1984 society. It was not an open society at all. So that was seen as a real encouraging thing by Reagan and by Americans. And it leads to summits. I'm a little out of order here. Reagan and Gorbachev have several summits, and things appear to be really warming up. Americans kind of relaxed. This is much better than even détente had been, and you end up with several arms reduction treaties, which of course they're mutually beneficial. The United States likes this openness and like relaxing the strict controls the country had with their command economy and their totalitarian government. But the Soviet Union, of course, they needed to reduce. So if they could get the United States to reduce weapon-wise too, both sides were happy with that tension reduction. So they kind of form a friendship, and things are warming up and significantly improving. And then Reagan is going to end up going back and kind of have the bookends of what the symbol of the Cold War is, the Berlin Wall. It's the greatest symbol probably. Reagan is going. Kennedy went in 1961 before it's built and says, "I tried to say I am a Berliner," and then the Berlin Wall is built when he says, "We will stay in Berlin. We will stay in Germany." Well, now we get to basically almost the end of the Cold War, and you see Reagan is going to say, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall." And by going to Germany and saying this, at the Berlin Wall, this is probably the most famous 4 words of many memorable speeches of the Reagan administration, Reagan presidency. But essentially, not too long after Reagan leaves office, we're going to see the Berlin Wall and the Cold War and the Soviet Union all collapse. But that's the topic for the next video. Stay classy, Sam Barlow.